Dune is like the grandfather to science fiction. It's a richly dense story, and many have tried and failed to adapt it while remaining true to the source material. And to many, this latest adaptation got it right. But the films leave out one massive detail: the Arab influence. The book is riddled with influences from North Africa and the Middle East, most obviously seen through the Fremen. So why does the movie purposely suppress these references? And does this actually betray the heart of the story? I'm going to go into what inspired the books and the extent of the Arab influence, and comparing the books to the films. So be warned, there may be spoilers ahead.
Young master, how does it feel to walk on a new world?
When it comes to world building, taking inspiration from our world histories is quite common in science fiction and fantasy. We see this in Lord of the Rings, Shadow and Bone, and also in Dune. Frank Herbert wrote Dune in the 1960s, and in order to create the syncretic, futuristic world, he read extensively, and drew from many different cultures. He drew inspiration from European empires, the mid-century US environmental movement, Zen Buddhism, the oil politics of the Middle East, and on it goes. By amalgamating so many different cultures, his goal was perhaps to predict what the future would look like, and this would make up the background settings in Dune. That's why the Dune universe, its language, its imagery, its religion, they all carry echoes of our own world. Herbert deliberately chooses names that already exist, or are slightly altered and so evoke recognizable time periods, environments, religions, and cultures, and construct the illusion of a universe that exists beyond the borders of the story itself. Dune is redolent of our world, and many of the imaginative structures can be likened to real-world geopolitics, like the Harkonnens to the Soviet Russians, House Atreides to American structures, or the Fremen to the Middle East. One-to-one analogies for Dune aren't always direct, mostly because Herbert purposely tried to defamiliarize obvious Western histories from the audience, but this effort is not matched when it comes to the East.
Well, my Arab friends wonder why it's called science fiction.
Sci-fi as a genre tends to be allegorical. They often have a hidden meaning because they work as a commentary on our own world, our leaders, or our social political systems. Just because a story is set in the stars doesn't mean it automatically escapes the complications that come with man-made systems of government. Some allegories are more obvious, and some are more intentional than others. We look at Animal Farm. This is a political allegory that intentionally explores the Russian Revolution and communism. Another example is Lord of the Rings, where the ultimate fight between good and evil can be seen as an allegory for World War I. But due to Tolkien's extensive world building, this link is more detached. Dune is also full of analogies, and many of them are intentional. Yes, there are analogues in Dune of today's events, corruption and bribery in the highest places, whole police forces lost to organized crime, regulatory agencies taken over by the people they're supposed to regulate. The scarce water of Dune is an exact analogue of oil scarcity. The heart of the book is a warning against colonialism, imperialism, and the abuse of resources, and the decimating impact it has on cultures and nature. These frameworks fit quite nicely to explain events in our world.
Dune is conceived of as a planet that is totally desert, so that water on it is the metaphor of, say, oil here, very appropriate at the moment. It is a metaphor of clean air, metaphor of water itself.
Many academics have extended this, agreeing that Arrakis and spice, as well as water scarcity, can be seen as an allegory for the Middle East and the oil conflicts in the 20th century. But allegory aside, the Dune universe itself is heavily influenced by Muslims and the MENA world.
I did a great deal of research into comparative religions, and so of course I could not overlook Muslim and its Arabic roots. And so I used Arabic. One of the major reasons is that for our culture, if you're going to say desert, you think Arab. And they have a marvelous culture. They were ecologically sane long before any other culture ever even thought of it. They had spoken and unspoken rules. For example, they would not build habitations on arable land.
The most obvious MENA influence is in the portrayal of Arrakis and the Fremen, who were inspired by the Bedouin and Amazigh, which directly translates to free man, as well as other cultures in North Africa and the Middle East. In Frank Herbert's biography, Dreamers of Dune, his son Brian confirms the extent of the influence. The story would include an Arab-like worldview, and the hero would be a messiah. He envisioned a desert messiah like the Mahdi or Muhammad on horseback. My father wanted a novel that would incorporate real elements from history, mixing them and casting them in a new light. Let's quickly talk about Orientalism. Edward Said defines Orientalism as the basic distinction between East and West as a starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, and political accounts concerning the Orient, its people, customs, mind, and destiny. This sometimes results in subtle and persistent Eurocentric prejudice against Arab Islamic peoples and their culture. If there is a determination of Western superiority, this ultimately leads to distortions when it comes to representing cultures in the Orient. The Western view of the East is therefore often shadowed and biased. For Arabs, these depictions range from Arabs living remotely in the desert, women as either exotic and hypersexual or oppressed, to just generally as the bad guys. So, Dune is obviously Orientalist. I mean, it was written by a white man in the 60s, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. As far as we know, Herbert never went to the Middle East, and most of his research was through reading. Herbert studied Oriental and Arabic languages and literature so extensively that he could think and write in those languages. But when you only learn about a culture, a language, a people from books, no matter how extensive the research, your view and interpretation of their culture will inevitably fall down in places. It's easy to start showcasing Orientalist tropes, even if that wasn't the intention. This begs the question, is it appropriate for an author to write outside their own ethnicity and culture? Now, there's no black and white answer for this. Each work of fiction has its own limitations, each author their own intentions. But the most important factor is empathy. Are the characters given agency? Are they coming from a place of appreciation and not overshadowing native voices? That being said, these novels should not be used to gain insight into these countries or cultures. It's best to gain that perspective from native creatives. The goal of a book is a believable story. We can only guess at Herbert's intentions, but I would say it's fairly clear. Herbert had a genuine desire to explore MENA culture, to understand the smallest details. I truly believe he was trying to come from a place of appreciation.
Herbert's novels actually are a great critique of Orientalism because there isn't a clear boundary between East and West. But I think in other ways it is Orientalist. More interesting Orientalism in the novels, the idea of the Fremen customs and how Herbert sometimes portrays them as rigid, brutal thing that, they're just, fighting each other with knife fights. But then if you look more broadly at the Dune universe, everybody does knife fights.
Now, there are some obvious tropes the Fremen fall into. They're shown as rigid to their customs, they're easily prone to false idols, and are easily exploited by the Bene Gesserits. But despite all the general romantic Orientalist flair, there is no doubt he actually likes the Fremen. He appreciates their traits, their traditions, their culture. He sees them as sophisticated. It's also worth quickly pointing out the Fremen were not solely inspired by the Bedouins. The Native American Quileute tribe and their activism against the American Empire also served as inspiration, for example. They had a similar and analogous struggle to the people in the Middle East and North Africa. But the point is, the Fremen are typically accepted as non-white. So we have a story about a white leader liberating the indigenous people from a colonizing force. But this is not a story about a white savior.
Messiahs should come with a label on the forehead, may be dangerous to your health.
There are many messages in Dune. One of the main ones is a warning.
Leaders amplify the mistakes. Their mistakes are amplified by the numbers who follow them without question. And charismatic leaders tend to build up followings, power structures. And those power structures tend to be taken over by people who are corruptible. I don't think that the old saw about power corrupting absolutely is accurate. I think power attracts the corruptible.
One of the inspirations of Dune was Lawrence of Arabia, the critically acclaimed film, a story about a British military officer aiding the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. This is an example of a white savior trope. Hollywood is filled with movies where a white leader alleviates the suffering of a people of color, or leads them to liberation as they have no agency and cannot liberate themselves. Paul is compared to a stand-in for T.E. Lawrence, a white outsider who attains native knowledge to then gain power over the indigenous people. Paul is given heroic agency to lead the colonized Fremen to freedom, agency which isn't given to the Fremen to liberate themselves. In Orientalist literature, there is typically a white savior, and there are definitely elements of this trope in Dune. Paul is usually always depicted as a white leader, while the people of Arrakis are non-white others. The Fremen are easily manipulated into thinking Paul is their messiah by the Bene Gesserits. And while Dune is Orientalist, when you look at the entire series, Paul is no savior. Dune is critiquing the human desire to follow saviors.
The book is very purposefully a dissection of two ideas. The white savior idea, because Herbert was very interested in T.E. Lawrence and the Lawrence of Arabia story and what inspired people to follow certain leaders. So there's very much this dynamic in the book where we see Paul as white, or at least an outsider in this community. And so Herbert is like dissecting, well, what would make people trust him? What rituals do we put faith or trust in? And what belief systems do we uphold over thousands of years? And something that he was very interested by was the idea of the Messiah, which is in Islam, but is also in Christianity, is in different religious belief systems. And so he was very interested in like what causes somebody to believe in a figure like that? How much faith does it take to wage a war to uphold or to like enact that prophecy of that idea?
Paul is not a hero. His actions precipitate a war that killed millions of people. Instead of liberating the Fremen, they are essentially recolonized by the Atreides Empire.
Now, it's my contention that the difference between a hero and an anti-hero is where you stop the story.
Herbert dramatizes in Dune an unpleasant political truth. People cannot free themselves of Machiavellian leaders until they first free themselves of their desire to be led.
Listen, Al-Ghaib. It's their name for Messiah.
When creating the languages of Dune, Herbert borrowed from many languages, from Russian to Latin to Hebrew. Sometimes he would even combine languages, cultures, and religions. This is an elision process, his attempt to show how language evolves over time. But despite the elision process, Herbert did little to distance the Arabic in Dune from the modern spoken language. Many of the words used are either direct translations, or they are transliterations of modern Arabic phrases that are easily recognized. There are many examples of this. Harakas, for instance, could come from Ayre. It could also stem from Raqs, which means dance. Lisan al-Ghaib translates to the tongue of the unseen or invisible, which Herbert translated in his glossary to the voice from the outer world. The Fremen term for people is Mist or Must, which is Egypt in Arabic. Sayyidina comes from Sayyid, which is the female Arabic equivalent of politely saying Mister. There's also some Arabic and Islamic influence outside the Fremen. The name of the Bene Gesserit Azhar book could potentially stem from Al-Azhar University in Egypt. In the Dune Galaxy, the planet Ikez is a name adopted from a site near Mecca in Saudi Arabia, Uqaz. The phrase Yahya Shuhada, roughly translated as long live the fighters or the martyrs. This was the revolutionary phrase the Algerians used during their war for independence against France's century-long rule. There are many more examples of Arabic in the entire series. The point is, Herbert employed an extensive use of Arabic, and he does play with written pronunciation and syllables, an attempt to show how Arabic would evolve over time. In many ways, language is used to link the audience from our world to the fantasy world. By employing a language that is unfamiliar to a Western audience, it helps to provide and create this idea of an otherworldly planet, and Arabic helps to link this to a desert setting. By looking at the language, there is no doubt that the Fremen are inextricably linked to the Middle East, a fact which is easily identified by its people today when reading Dune. Herbert had a genuine desire to explore the Middle East, to dig further into a rich culture, and he mostly wrote from a place of appreciation.
Is the book Orientalist? Yes, I think so. But I also think that like it is a product of its time in that way. And there are levels of Orientalism, I think, just like how there are levels of all things.
For all its shortcomings, including the centering of a romantic Orientalist perspective, while what we get is a romantic view of Arabs, it is a form of positive representation, even though it's flawed. So why was such a rich culture, despite its heavy influence in the books, reduced to a mere aesthetic in the films?
Muad'Dib, the prophet?
In book to film adaptations, it's inevitable that not everything will be captured in the film, and elements are changed, especially when the source material is dense like Dune. Dune Parts 1 and 2 have a clear focus, to present Arrakis as culturally ambiguous. So why did the film make the creative changes that it did? Well, mainly, the context has changed.
The prophet. Why is that a bad thing? Use it. Because all my visions lead to horror. Because you lose control. Because I gain it.
Dune is a story inherently rooted in politics. Herbert was a journalist, and lots of his analogies come from commentary on empire and world leaders. When Dune came out in the 60s, how the audience saw the book would have been completely different to today. Here's some significant events that occurred during this time. This was the beginning of decolonization efforts in the Middle East. It was a time when we entered the Cold War. There were high political tensions between the US and the USSR. Key moments were the drawing of the Iron Curtain, the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was still a lingering fear of communism. JFK became president, led the US to the Vietnam War, and then was assassinated. All political events around this time showcased the rise and fall of leaders and empire, all of which influenced Dune. Overall, the focus was more on communism, and there was less of a negative outlook in the Middle East, as there is today. Today, our ideas of dangerous leaders shifted from charismatic to extremist. We are far more skeptical of our leaders, and we're also more distant and critical of religion. As the Cold War ended, we have now shifted to the 21st century war on terror, and an increased skepticism of Arabs and Islam in the Middle East. there is a rise of anti-MENA sentiment in media, as we are fed the idea of a region torn apart by war and full of dangerous figures. Many of the points in Dune about leaders and empire are still relevant today, but in our collective consciousness, their target has changed. The big global threat in the West shifted from Russia to the Middle East. And to an audience, that is what they see when looking at a war in a desert landscape. There are many choices made when adapting a book, but the best book adaptations are able to balance sticking to the written word and maintaining the spirit of the story.
When adapting a story, you have two choices: stick to the script or stick to the spirit. A good example of this is Little Women. In the original book, Jo gets married, and in the 2020 movie, she doesn't. When the book was published, teaching girls to aspire to marriage was like a good thing, because women didn't really have access to the same financial securities that they have now, and therefore the path to financial security and a good life was marriage. In 2020 though, teaching girls that they should only aspire to marriage is like not a fantastic thing, because they now have other options. Little Women is about celebrating womanhood and independence, and it was quite progressive for its time. So the 2020 version tries to keep with the spirit of that by adapting the story to teach the same progressive morals, but to a modern audience.
Dune was written almost 70 years ago. The filmmakers should absolutely take the time to update the material, because the context has changed, and context matters. Since adaptations engage the discursive energies of their time, they become a barometer of the ideological trends circulating during the moments of production. Each recreation of a novel for the cinema unmasks facets not only of the novel and its period and culture of origin, but also the time and culture of adaptation. In trying to create a politically correct film to adhere to the Western socio-political sphere, the Dune films decide to repress MENA influences while retaining vague imagery that is reminiscent of the Middle East for a mainly Western audience. A lot of these changes from the source material are inherently political, and they are a product of the current Western perception of the Middle East. But this inherently betrays the spirit of Dune.
Islam is a very strong element of the whole trilogy. We tend in this culture not to study Islam, not to recognize how much it has contributed to our culture because of the religious wars out of which our present consciousness has come. But we owe Islam enormous debts of gratitude.
Arrakis and the Fremen are shown as culturally ambiguous people of color. This is enforced through the music, the language, the clothes, and the casting. There's no direct cultural specificity, and this is intentional. This could be their way of updating the material and detaching it from our world, to present a future world that transcends racial consciousness that is present in society today. After all, this does take place in space thousands of years into the future, and this is a common feature in science fiction. But while it succeeds in other forms, it's not as successfully executed in Dune. The writers Jon Spaihts and Denis Villeneuve were intentional in their de-Arabization and de-Islamization of Dune.
The book is filled with loan words and borrowed traditions and a kind of extrapolation of a proto-Arab civilization into the far future. But the fact is that to a typical American, the Arab world was much more exotic in the 1960s than it is today. So if you were to build a kind of Arab future on Arrakis in a novel starting today, you would need to invent more and borrow less. Essentially to expropriate intact fewer things and rather extrapolate more into the future and envision that society evolving and changing.
The goal, you could argue, was well-intentioned, to de-orientalize the books. But despite this, they did fail to address the negative tropes and imagery present in both Dune films. A desert landscape now reminds people of news images of a war-torn Middle East, which wasn't the case in the 60s. They also portray the Fremen as a faceless group, or extremely religious. This is also not a justification for the film's exclusion of MENA creative voices in the writer's room or in the cast. Despite both films emptying Dune of its Middle Eastern and North African influences, what remains is still significant enough to identify the Fremen as culturally Arab or Bedouin. Previous adaptations have also failed to show this accurately, and this new 21st century adaptation is no different, but in a different way. In this version, everything that is Arab is reduced to an Oriental aesthetic. Now, taking inspiration isn't new for movies. It's typically done in costume design, for example. The Dune costume designer looked at North Africa for inspiration. Lady Jessica's chain link was given a Bedouin feel. Chani's white dress is Moroccan-inspired to give a North African appeal. Zendaya's clothes with her blue eyes have even been compared to the famous photo of the Afghan girl in National Geographic. But given the deep Arabic influences, the choice of clothing does have a subliminal impact on the audience, especially in a desert setting. Context always matters. Through the proxy of non-Arab or white bodies, these garments are seen as beautiful and high fashion. They are a sanitized version of a culture that is otherwise condemned as backwards or oppressive. There also seems to be no MENA input for any of these decisions.
How did you incorporate Islamic and Middle East, North Africa themes from the book into your script? Did you approach, for instance, MENA and Muslim actors for advice on how to put it together?
There were conversations that are more reading than talking.
Herbert had a similar approach. He read extensively, but as I said before, this caused him to unintentionally incorporate Orientalist tropes. Reading is not a substitute for the native voice. When reading about a culture that is not your own, your view will sometimes fall down, because of biases which are a product of your worldview and environment. In the case of the West reading about the East, this leads to Orientalist interpretations. Orientalism in both the Dune films could have easily been avoided. They didn't really have an excuse not to get the perspectives of MENA people today. Employing these creators is how they could explore Dune's Arab voice, to elevate the Arabic influences and help adjust or eliminate the Orientalism in line with the overall creative vision. Herbert imagined a culture that evolved from modern Arabs. They could have created futuristic Fremen customs, language, and clothes based on this while remaining true to Herbert's vision. Instead, the films reduced everything Arab to mere window dressing, as a means to visually sell an exotic alien planet.
Rolling over the sands, you can see spice in the air.
Hollywood is working towards better representation, and sometimes it even gets it right. But let's not forget, Hollywood will always prioritize profits over cultural respect. It's not in the business for good representation. Dune on the surface is highly praised for its diverse cast. In an interview, Villeneuve said the following: "I tried to be as faithful as possible to Frank Herbert's description, and this idea that the world of the Fremen would be kind of inspired by culture from North Africa and the Middle East. Culture that I deeply love, by the way, because it's a very complex world. There was this idea that there was something powerful that will come out of Africa in Frank Herbert's mind, and I tried to respect his ideas, which is why I did the casting the way I did, and I feel truly that I'm right in doing it this way." There are no North African or Middle Eastern actors in main roles, so this is a little confusing. Despite the fact that the Fremen are inspired by MENA culture, they're instead shown as a culturally non-specific, non-white other. Now, Dune 2 did improve on this slightly with the casting of Tunisian-Swiss actress Souheila Yacoub. Was this a response to the backlash from Dune 1? Who's to say? Is this an example of tokenism? A minor character cast as a point towards inclusion for MENA actors? Maybe. This is absolutely not to diminish her work. She is absolutely incredible in her role. But the point is, casting one actress isn't the entire solution. MENA actors don't get much representation in Hollywood cinema. In 2023, they accounted for only 1% of roles, and 0% in leading roles. When they are in the media, 78% of the time they are typically shown as dangerous, tyrants, refugees, or oppressed. There's a long history of negative representation. A negative Middle Eastern stereotype has been constructed, and the audience has been trained to inextricably associate Middle Eastern people as dangerous. They have aroused the fear of the other. But in Dune, the Fremen are the good guys. They're sophisticated, they show a mastery of their craft. But the question that is always raised is sensitivity.
Is an Orientalist in presenting a people that live in the desert and wear robes and believe in a Messiah? Sure. But are they given dignity and interiority and authority within their world? Yes. So that's my exhaustion with this, well, do you want the Fremen played by Middle Eastern actors? Because they're. It's well, then you're entirely missing the point. And if you think they're, then why are you so pumped about Zendaya playing?
This is what's so frustrating about it. It's the idea so wait a sec, this is, so we're not allowed to play it because they're that, but it's okay for another ethnic minority to play.
Not casting MENA actors as main characters is not the solution for Dune. You don't avoid racist tropes by removing the people altogether, or by swapping one person of color for another. The choice to not allow Arabs to have a rare moment of positive representation seems to be a massive oversight. Villeneuve and the creatives should have done the work to update the source material to bring a book written 70 years ago to the modern world. And the way to do that was to involve MENA creatives, people who could draw on their knowledge, and hone the story to one that more accurately explores their experiences and erases traces of Orientalism. So while the director can say he loves MENA culture, apparently the creatives don't respect it enough to put in the work or cast them in leading roles. Say what you will about Herbert being Orientalist, he put in the hours, he did the work. Now, should all of the Fremen have been exclusively MENA heritage actors? Not necessarily. And given the constraints of Hollywood, and their preference for casting known talent to ensure profits, there are more likely other elements of production at play. But given the story's strong influences, having at least some MENA actors in the main cast, not even exclusively Fremen, would have been a great nod of appreciation.
These are sacred. They can't survive without me.
Another area the films fall down is through language. In the books, Arabic is used extensively in the languages of Dune, particularly with the Fremen. In the films, David Peterson is the creator of the Fremen language. They said that Dune was set so far in the future that it would be completely, and I mean completely, impossible for so much recognizable Arabic to survive. In the film, they elected to keep only a handful of Arabic in Dune. There's Mahdi, Lisan al-Ghib, Shayhulud, Jinn, Mu'addib or Mu'addib, Usul or Usul in Arabic, and Sayyidina, as well as the Algerian liberation rallying cry Yahya Shuhada. But in this case, they keep the translation, long live the fighters, and remove the Arabic from the historic phrase, replacing it with Peterson's own language.
Come on, brother, it's a fake language.
But these words aren't pretend. They're real Arabic words that are recognizable by current native speakers. There will always be critiques about loyalty to the source material in book film adaptations. So this deviation to only keep some Arabic compared to the extensive use in the book in itself is not reductive. But based on Peterson's own logic, this doesn't explain why modern Mandarin appears in Dune. Apparently Mandarin will survive, as is, over thousands of years and remain relatively unchanged. It's odd they found it crucial to justify why Arabic isn't present in the future at all, not even an evolved version. There's a lack of consistency in these explanations, and it undermines Herbert's intention in the novel, which was to show how Arabic would have evolved over time. It wasn't just mere window dressing. Herbert's heavy reliance on borrowings from Arabic to bring Dune to life are also the thematic fabric of the narrative. Without Arabic, Arrakis would not make much geographical or cultural sense, which is why Herbert makes the language a central pillar in the world-building process. A language constitutive of the identity and ethos of the planet and its inhabitants, sparking the previously discussed debates about the Orientalism of Dune. I think they really overcompensated when they chose to suppress all Arabic references in the book. Instead of putting in the time to imagine and create a futuristic Arabic language, it's completely erased and replaced by a new made-up Fremen language. The Arabic that does remain in the films is also further defamiliarized from the audience and distanced from its origins, through incredibly poor pronunciation by the cast.
Lisan al-Gaib. I don't believe you're the Lisan al-Gaib. They say you're the Mahdi. Wadib.
The cast could have definitely put a bit more effort into pronouncing these words correctly, particularly as they are current words in modern Arabic. There is also a lack of cohesiveness in the Fremen accents, even the ones supposedly from the same region. Perhaps this was to further perpetuate the idea that the Fremen are a culturally non-conforming people. Now this is a minor point, I just found it a bit jarring while watching the films. The few Arabic elements they decided to keep, due to necessity, is treated with very little appreciation. This is very different to Herbert's own effort to help translate the Arabic for the Western readers of the novel. The lack of inclusion in the creation of the film is completely hypocritical considering the anti-colonial themes of the novel. No matter how contemporary these adaptations may seem to a 21st century audience, it fails to subvert any of the Orientalism present in the books. It just reinforces them. These films not only profit off the MENA aesthetic, but they actively suppress the Arab creative voice, and the result are films that are more Orientalist than the book. Art never exists in a vacuum. Context matters. How society operates, what we see on TikTok or the news impacts how we see the world, and it greatly impacts media. There's been a trend in media that claims diversity in film doesn't attract an audience, but this has been proven wrong time and time again. There is a demand for new stories, diverse stories that actually reflect the world we live in. The Dune films missed a massive opportunity. What's left in the film is a whisper of the culture that heavily inspired the world building. Nothing about what I've discussed overrides that the films are visually stunning. There's a reason Dune remains so popular. It's incredibly complex and thoughtful. Commentary on it can never be black and white because there's too much nuance in the story. But two things can be true at once. You can love Dune, but we can and we should also criticize it for its shortcomings. It's crucial to critically identify and analyze Orientalism in art and media. It's the only way to identify biases, deconstruct both negative and romantic portrayals, so we can do better and move towards more inclusive cinema. If you have different opinions on this, please let me know. Given the complexity, I'm sure many of you will have different opinions. But as for me, this movie can never be great. Because when I watch it, all I see is everything they left out, and all the people they left behind.